the America First economic policy was unveiled with a clear, resonant promise. It was a promise to protect American workers, to revitalize domestic manufacturing, and to bring jobs back to the industrial heartland, the communities collectively known as the Rust Belt economy 2025. The stated goal was a resurgence, a return to American economic dominance built on tariffs that would shield domestic industries from unfair competition. That was the promise. But every economic policy has a price tag. Beyond the political rallies and the headlines, who actually received the bill for this trade strategy? This story isn't about Washington, Beijing, or Brussels. It's about the real-world consequences felt on the ground in the soybean fields of Iowa, the manufacturing plants of Ohio, and the small-town communities of Pennsylvania. Today, we are not analyzing the politics. We are analyzing the numbers. The most profound and tragic failure of the America First tariff strategy is not that it failed to bring allies to heel. It's that it successfully crippled its own political base, inflicting direct, measurable economic pain on the American farmers and Rust Belt workers it promised to protect. Using verified data from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, USDA, the Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, and industry-specific reports, we will analyze the dual hit, the painful economic squeeze that this policy inflicted on its own supporters, the Farm Belt's pain. Before the trade war, the economic relationship between American farmers and their neighbors was one of deep integration. For decades, Canada and Mexico weren't just customers. They were the largest, most stable, and most reliable buyers for a vast array of American agriculture. This was especially true for the Midwest. American farmers in the Farm Belt built their businesses around this stable demand for corn, soybeans, and pork. It was a predictable, multi-generational partnership. Then, the tariffs began. When the U.S. imposed Section 232 tariffs on steel and aluminum, it wasn't just a surgical strike against foreign producers. It was a broad economic provocation. And America's trading partners, including Canada, Mexico, and China, retaliated. Their retaliation was precise, strategic, and aimed directly at the most politically sensitive sector of the U.S. economy, agriculture. This brings us to the first blow of the dual hit, the export collapse. American farmers suddenly found themselves on the front lines of a U.S. farmers' trade war they did not ask for. Let's use a specific case study, Iowa. According to a comprehensive analysis by the USDA, the impact of these retaliatory tariffs was not spread evenly. It was concentrated heavily in the Midwest, and Iowa, the data shows, was the single hardest hit state. Researchers from Iowa State University, CARD, calculated the total damage. The state of Iowa alone suffered an estimated $1.46 billion in economic losses. Let's break that number down, because it reveals the strategy. Of that $1.46 billion, $1.2 billion of the loss came from soybeans. Another $776 million was lost in the pork industry. These were not random numbers. These were targeted strikes against America's most productive agricultural centers. Canadian and Mexican buyers, who had relied on Iowa farmers for decades, were now forced by their own government's tariffs to find new suppliers. And they did. They turned to Brazil, Argentina, and Europe. This Canada trade diversion wasn't just a temporary shift, it was the severing of decades-old supply chains. American farmers lost contracts, and their competitors in South America signed them. As this global shift happened, the U.S. market was flooded with its own unsold products. Basic economics took over. When demand collapses, prices follow. The price of soybeans and pork at the farm gate plummeted, and with it, the income of American farmers. But this was only the first half of the economic vice. As farmers were watching their profits evaporate, they were simultaneously hit by the second blow, the input squeeze. The very same Section 232 steel tariffs that had triggered the agricultural retaliation also had a domestic consequence. They were designed to protect U.S. steel producers. But farmers are not steel producers. They are massive steel consumers. Every tractor, every combine, every grain bin, every piece of farm machinery is made from steel. When the tariffs made imported steel more expensive, domestic U.S. steel producers were able to raise their own prices. And they did. The cost of American steel and aluminum skyrocketed. For a company like John Deere, one of the largest employers in the Midwest, this wasn't a minor adjustment. It was a massive financial blow. John Deere reported to its investors that the new steel tariffs were costing the company $200 million per quarter. That's a projected $600 million per year in new, unexpected cost. That $600 million bill doesn't just disappear. It's not absorbed by the corporation. It is passed on directly to the customer. The price of every new tractor, every harvester, and every planter went up. This was the dual hit. The American farmer was now trapped. The price they could sell their crops for was collapsing. The price they had to pay for their equipment was exploding. They were squeezed from both ends by the same policy. The Trump tariffs backfire was not a theoretical concept in an economic textbook. It was a devastating reality on the ground in the American heartland, the Rust Belt's burden. The narrative sold to the Rust Belt economy 2025 was simpler. The promise was that the Section 232 tariffs would be a savior for American steel. By taxing foreign steel, American steel mills in Pennsylvania and Ohio would roar back to life, bringing back high-paying U.S. manufacturing job loss that had been lost for decades. But this promise concealed a dangerous economic paradox. The steel savior paradox. The question we must ask is not, did the tariffs help U.S. steel producers? The question is, what was the net effect on the entire manufacturing economy? Because for every one job in the United States that makes steel, there are dozens of jobs in industries that use steel. The auto industry, heavy machinery, construction, appliance manufacturing. These downstream industries are the lifeblood of the Rust Belt, and for them, the steel tariffs were not a shield. They were a weapon turned against them. When the cost of domestic steel shot up, every single American manufacturer that uses steel was put at an immediate disadvantage against their global competitors in Germany, Japan, and South Korea, who were all still buying steel at lower global market prices. This brings us to the mathematical reality of the job ratio. Let's look at a case study, Ohio. A study from Ohio State University's John Glenn College of Public Affairs analyzed the state's employment landscape. What they found was staggering. For every one worker in Ohio employed in the metal production industry, there were 36 workers employed in the metal-using industries. A 3:6-to-1 ratio. When the tariffs helped that one job, they simultaneously burdened the other 36. But what was the national impact? This is where the numbers become truly sobering. The Peterson Institute for International Economics, PIIE, a respected nonpartisan think tank, analyzed the net effect of the steel tariffs on U.S. employment. Their analysis found that while the tariffs may have created a small number of jobs in the protected steel sector, it came at the cost of an estimated 75,000 jobs lost in other manufacturing sectors. Source 4.1, 4.3. U.S. manufacturing job loss did not reverse. It accelerated in the very sectors that use steel. The policy, designed to protect American manufacturing, became a net destroyer of American manufacturing jobs. But the analysis gets even more precise. Let's talk about the cost per job. Economists are able to calculate the welfare cost of tariffs, that is, the total economic drag the tariff places on consumers and businesses, divided by the number of jobs it claims to save. The PIIE study calculated this exact figure. The result, the steel tariffs cost the U.S. economy over $900,000 per year for each individual job that was created or saved. Over $900,000 per job per year. This was not protection. It was an extraordinarily expensive and inefficient subsidy paid for by the downstream manufacturers in Ohio and Michigan. The promise was to revive the Rust Belt. The reality was that the policy made it more expensive, less competitive, and cost it tens of thousands of jobs. It was another strategic failure, where the burden was placed squarely on the shoulders of the very workers the policy claimed to champion. The strategic failure and persistent damage. When we take a step back and look at the complete picture, the Trump tariffs backfire is total. The strategy failed at every level, and the bill was sent to the very people who were promised a renaissance. Let's review the final scorecard. In the Farm Belt, farmers were caught in a dual hit. Hit number one, the collapse of their export markets, as retaliatory tariffs from Canada, Mexico, and China erased billions in sales. Hit number two, the explosion of their input costs, as steel tariffs made the machinery they depend on, like John Deere tractors, prohibitively expensive. In the Rust Belt, manufacturers were caught in a similar vice. Hit number one, the surge in raw material costs, as steel tariffs destroyed their competitive advantage. Hit number two, the net loss of 75,000 jobs in the very manufacturing sectors that use steel against a 3:6-to-1 employment ratio. This was not a short-term adjustment, it was a long-term strategic blunder. And this is the most critical point. This damage is persistent. When Canada trade diversion forces Canadian importers to find new, non-U.S. suppliers of soybeans, they sign multi-year contracts. When U.S. manufacturing supply chain disruption makes American suppliers unreliable, companies reroute their logistics. These relationships, once broken, do not simply snap back into place when the politics change. A 2024 study from Princeton University confirmed this, finding that the damage to downstream exporters from the trade war was highly persistent. This brings us back to our central thesis. The most profound and tragic failure of the America First tariff strategy is not that it failed to bring allies to heel. It is that it successfully crippled its own political base, inflicting direct, measurable economic pain on the American farmers and Rust Belt workers it promised to protect. And this supply chain disruption isn't just a simple fix. In fact, it's forcing major American companies to make strategic moves most people aren't seeing. That's why in our next video, we investigate the quiet shift of manufacturing giants like John Deere to Mexico, and what that means for the future of American jobs. Click the video on your screen to watch that report. Before we go, we want to hear from you. If you work in farming or manufacturing, have you personally seen the real-world cost of this trade war in your community? Or do you believe this is just the short-term pain necessary for a long-term American comeback? Share your story in the comments. We believe economic policies must be judged by their results, not their promises. And the data shows, for the Farm Belt and the Rust Belt, the result was a bill that they are still paying today. Subscribe for more data-driven, neutral analytic reports on the economic forces shaping your world. Stay informed.